Sandra Lee's story is often introduced as a modern media phenomenon, but that framing only scratches the surface of what actually unfolded. Before the cameras and viral clips, she was a working dermatologist, committed to a specialty many overlooked and even fewer celebrated. Her path did not begin with celebrity ambition or a calculated media strategy. It began with steady training, long hours, and a practice built on patience rather than spectacle. Yet something about her work carried a rare visibility. Patients came to her with conditions that affected not only their skin but their sense of self, and she responded with a kind of grounded empathy that translated easily through a lens. When she eventually stepped in front of a camera, it was not to perform a persona but to document what already existed in her clinic. That decision, simple on the surface, would redirect her entire life. The world did not just watch, it returned repeatedly, drawn by something it could not fully articulate. Her presence became familiar across platforms and countries, not because she sought attention, but because she offered something unfiltered in a space often defined by polish and distance. What followed was not just fame, but a long unfolding of identity under observation. Foundations built in quiet clinics and unseen years. Long before public recognition, Sandra Lee built her career in a place far removed from the centers of media influence. Upland, California was not a destination city for medical fame, and that suited her early professional life. She focused on becoming a board-certified dermatologist, moving through training and early practice with a consistency that left little room for shortcuts. Dermatology, unlike many other specialties, carries an intimate connection to identity. Skin is visible, immediate, and often emotionally charged. Her patients did not simply arrive with medical concerns, they arrived with stories shaped by embarrassment, avoidance, or long-standing insecurity. Over time, she developed a communication style that was unusually disarming. She explained conditions without condescension and treated visible issues without reducing the person experiencing them. That combination of technical skill and human attentiveness became the foundation of her practice. There was no branding exercise behind it, no public persona being constructed. It was simply how she worked. In those years, success was measured in patient trust and clinical outcomes rather than reach or recognition. Yet those same qualities would later become the reason millions of strangers felt connected to her work, even before they understood her background or credentials. The moment medical practice became public storytelling. The shift from private clinician to public figure did not begin with ambition, but with curiosity and timing. As digital platforms expanded, particularly video sharing spaces, Sandra Lee observed a growing openness around unusual or behind-the-scenes content. Rather than crafting a polished media strategy, she began recording straightforward documentation of her procedures. These early videos were not designed for virality. They were functional, direct, and often filmed without elaborate production. What emerged, unexpectedly, was audience fascination. Viewers who had never considered watching dermatological procedures found themselves unable to look away. The reactions were not purely sensational. Many described a sense of calm, education, or even relief. Her work, already centered on visible transformation, translated naturally into visual storytelling. Unlike many online personalities who carefully manage image and narrative, she remained focused on the medical reality of what she was doing. That authenticity became the defining feature of her growing audience. As views multiplied, so did the reach of her influence. She was no longer simply treating patients in a clinic. She was introducing millions of people to a form of medicine they had rarely seen so closely, and doing so without altering its essential nature for entertainment. From online curiosity to global television recognition. As her digital presence expanded, mainstream media attention followed. The transition from online videos to television was not framed as reinvention but as amplification. The launch of her show brought structured storytelling, yet it preserved the core dynamic that had drawn viewers in the first place. Real patients, real procedures, and visible transformation. Television introduced a new scale. Episodes reached audiences who might never have encountered her online work, and the emotional response deepened as stories were given more context. Patients were not just subjects of medical treatment but individuals whose confidence and daily lives were often profoundly affected by long-standing conditions. The format allowed space for their vulnerability, as well as their relief. Sandra Lee remained central to that dynamic, not as a performer but as a consistent professional presence, guiding people through deeply personal change. The show's success was not built on shock value alone, but on repetition of a simple structure. Someone arrives burdened by something visible, and leaves lighter in both physical and emotional ways. Over time, this pattern created a kind of trust between viewer and physician, one that extended beyond entertainment into something closer to shared witnessing. A marriage, a career, and the weight of parallel lives. Behind her expanding public presence, Sandra Lee maintained a long-term marriage with fellow dermatologist Jeffrey Rebish. Their relationship represented a different kind of balance, one built not on shared fame, but on shared profession and diverging public roles. While she moved increasingly into media visibility, he remained largely outside of it, focused on clinical practice and family life. This kind of arrangement requires continuous adjustment rather than static agreement. Over time, their lives developed in parallel directions, connected but not identical. Professionally, Sandra continued to expand her platform, launching skincare products and extending her brand into commercial spaces grounded in dermatological expertise. Personally, she navigated the complexity of being both a physician and a public figure in a way few in her field had experienced. The demands of television production, online engagement, and medical responsibility created a layered existence that left little unstructured space. Even as outward success accumulated, the internal architecture of her life became more intricate. What appeared stable from a distance was, in reality, a constantly evolving negotiation between private identity and public expectation, between partnership and individual trajectory. The diagnosis that reframed everything quietly. In 2019, Sandra Lee publicly disclosed a breast cancer diagnosis linked to a BRCA2 genetic mutation. The announcement was not delayed or softened for effect. It was shared directly, in her own words, before speculation could take shape. This choice reflected a pattern consistent with her career, confronting visible realities without avoidance. Her medical decisions, including a double mastectomy and reconstruction, were also shared with openness, not as performance but as extension of her existing transparency. What made this period significant was not only the medical journey itself but the way it intersected with her public identity. Her audience, already accustomed to seeing vulnerability in others through her work, responded with unusually personal engagement. Many viewers shared their own experiences with illness, screening, and fear. The exchange created a feedback loop of honesty that extended beyond entertainment media. Yet behind that exchange was a deeply human process of recovery that could not be fully translated into content. Fatigue, uncertainty, and emotional recalibration existed outside the frame. The experience did not redefine her career, but it did alter her relationship with time, health, and the limits of what can be continuously shared. Fame, pressure, and the quiet shifts behind visibility. As her career continued after recovery, Sandra Lee operated within a landscape shaped by constant visibility. Success brought expansion, but also accumulation of expectation. Multiple professional roles required sustained energy: television production, medical practice, brand development, and public engagement. Over time, the rhythm of visibility itself began to carry weight. Fame in this context was not a sudden disruption but a gradual compression of personal space. Even a career built on authenticity must eventually contend with the boundaries of what remains private. During this period, observers noted subtle changes in her public communication style. She spoke about wellness, boundaries, and health with increased specificity, shaped less by general professional insight and more by lived experience. Her tone remained steady, but more selective. She did not dramatize difficulty or frame resilience as spectacle. Instead, she described her experiences with a measured clarity that reflected long-term processing rather than immediate reaction. The accumulation of roles and expectations created a life that was outwardly successful and inwardly complex, requiring ongoing adjustment that was not visible in public-facing content. A relationship receding from public visibility. Without formal announcement or dramatic framing, signs emerged that Sandra Lee's long marriage had undergone significant change. The absence of public declaration was notable in itself, given her history of openness in other areas of her life. Instead of commentary, there was distance. Instead of explanation, there was quiet transition. In a media environment that often turns personal change into narrative, the lack of performance stood out. For many observers, this shift was interpreted not as scandal but as privacy being deliberately reclaimed. Long-term relationships, particularly those intertwined with professional lives, often evolve in ways that resist simple explanation. In Sandra Lee's case, the visible change was less about public events and more about absence of shared appearances and reduced overlap in public-facing contexts. Her audience, familiar with her rhythm of openness, responded with measured curiosity rather than intrusion. The situation reflected a broader truth about public figures. Not everything meaningful is announced, and not every transition is designed for consumption. Some changes unfold without commentary, existing fully only to those directly involved. Midlife reflection and the question of continuity. Reaching her mid-50s, Sandra Lee occupied a space shaped by accumulation rather than transition alone. Her career was established, her audience global, and her professional influence sustained across multiple platforms. Yet midlife in any public career often brings a quieter internal reckoning. The question shifts from building to sustaining, from expansion to intention. For someone whose work is deeply connected to human vulnerability, this reflection carries additional depth. Years of witnessing transformation in others inevitably prompts reflection on one's own trajectory. She continued working, producing content, and engaging with patients, but her public tone increasingly reflected introspection rather than growth narrative. She spoke less about expansion and more about meaning, less about output and more about purpose. This shift was not a withdrawal, but a reorientation. The core question became less about what could be built next and more about what remained essential. In this stage, identity is no longer constructed from ambition alone but from experience, continuity, and the ability to remain aligned with work that still feels necessary rather than merely successful. A career that continued without needing reinvention. Despite personal transitions and shifting life structures, Sandra Lee's professional presence did not diminish. Her show continued, her medical practice remained active, and her skincare brand matured into a stable extension of her clinical expertise. What distinguished this phase was not reinvention but continuity. In an industry that often demands constant rebranding, her work remained anchored in the same core principle: visible transformation grounded in medical care. Patients still arrived carrying conditions that affected their confidence and daily life. She still addressed them with the same combination of technical precision and emotional awareness. Over time, this consistency became its own form of authority. She did not need to dramatically reposition herself because her foundation remained unchanged. The audience that followed her work had also matured alongside it, many having watched for years. In that continuity, there was a sense of familiarity that extended beyond entertainment. It was a sustained relationship between viewer and practitioner, built not on novelty but on repetition of trust, reinforced episode after episode, case after case. A life still unfolding beyond the frame. At this stage, Sandra Lee's story resists clean closure. It is neither a rise and fall narrative, nor a simple account of success. It is an ongoing life shaped by medicine, visibility, personal change, and sustained public engagement. What remains most consistent is not any single phase of her career, but the underlying approach she brings to her work. Directness, empathy, and a refusal to turn human vulnerability into spectacle. The details of her personal life continue to evolve outside public documentation, while her professional presence remains steady. What her journey ultimately illustrates is not a final achievement but a sustained way of being present in difficult spaces, both for others and for herself. Her influence persists not because of a single defining moment, but because of accumulated trust built over years of showing up. In a media landscape often driven by reinvention, her story is defined more by continuity, and at 55, that continuity itself becomes the most meaningful statement. A life still in progress, still engaged, and still committed to looking directly at what others often avoid.